Shadow Hack. Chapter 531, The Lack of Food Supplies. After focusing on him, Li Yunmu noticed that the birdman's outer appearance was quite different from that of humans. He had snow-white wings on his back. Regardless of wherever he went, they were bound to attract attention. However, even with such a conspicuous appearance, Li Yunmu had subconsciously overlooked him. If Wang Ren hadn't pointed him out, Li Yunmu may have ignored him for the whole auction. This was extremely strange. At that moment, Li Yunmu finally understood what was strange. The man was meticulously emitting a formless pressure to make people meticulously neglect his presence. Even if Li Yunmu's perception had increased recently and he possessed a keen intuition, he still couldn't escape the birdman's influence and subconsciously overlook his existence. What race does he belong to? Li Yunmu inquired in a deadpan voice. If the records collected by the successive generations of Pangu aren't wrong, he should be a deus. While saying that, Wang Ren subconsciously lowered his voice to the extreme. Clearly, even if he was just an ordinary person who didn't understand cultivators' power levels, he was still afraid of the deus. Him. Li Yunmu was extremely astonished when he heard Wang Ren's words. Not long ago, Li Yunmu had learned that deus was the most formidable race among the 1,000 races of the origin world and that they hadn't appeared in the world for a long time. They were said to live in the clouds, high above the world. Under the gravitational pull of the origin world, it wasn't easy to step foot above the clouds when compared to Earth. Even if a sage flux expert possessed the strength to fly, the greatest height which their strength allowed them to reach was around 3 kilometers above ground. But this was far below the altitude of clouds. Yet each member of the most formidable race, the deus, could live above the clouds. This clearly showed just how terrifying they were. But the legendary deus were said to not have come down for a long time. Yet Wang Ren guessed that the alien race person which resembled a birdman was surprisingly a legendary deus. With Wang Ren's explanation though, he gradually understood the meaning behind the status provided to the people of sound. Wang Ren had learned from the records in the library that the reason why the deus provided asylum to the sound was mainly because their women were one of the companions of deus for breeding and producing descendants. Sound people actually used a matrilineal system. In each year's festival of the sound, a large number of girls who had recently entered adulthood would come out. The best of them who surpassed others in all aspects would then be delivered to deus. They would become vessels for sowing seeds for the next generation of the deus. Because of this, the weak sound people were one of the few who received asylum from the deus. According to Wang Ren's explanation, every member of the deus possessed an extremely tyrannical bloodline which made it extremely difficult to produce offspring among themselves. Apart from the sound, who had become the target for sowing next generation seeds, there were 3 more races who received the same treatment. After hearing Wang Ren's words, Li Yunmu couldn't help but feel sorrow for the weak race. He clearly understood why races like the sound would basically take the initiative to offer their most beautiful, pure, and outstanding women to the deus. It was all to ensure the continuous survival of their race. Clearly, the woman who had a deus protecting her wasn't an ordinary one. She was likely to be someone who carried an offspring of the deus. Otherwise, she wouldn't deserve the personal protection of a deus standing guard by her side. But even after Wang Ren's explanations, Li Yunmu still couldn't feel the birdman's existence nor could get a feel about his strength. He couldn't see through him, he still couldn't see through him. Li Yunmu secretly used a few tricks, but he still couldn't see through the deus. Instead, the other party seemed to have sensed his actions and began to check his surroundings in confusion. Li Yunmu was slightly astonished and quickly withdrew his probing tricks. From that moment, he became even more certain that the birdman who didn't seem to possess even a single iota of power was frighteningly formidable. Even if Li Yunmu possessed the Azure Dragon expert armor which had allowed his combat strength to leap to the point that he could battle sage flux experts, he still couldn't match up to the birdman. Like a bird startled by a mere twang of a bow, Li Yunmu withdrew his thoughts and no longer spied on the other party. Even if given his strength he could be counted among the powerhouses of the origin world, he still wasn't powerful enough to stand against the deists who were the most powerful of the 1,000 races. Pangu City's auction continued after the first sale. The second item to be auctioned also left Li Yunmyo completely startled. It was another weapon of Pangu which didn't lose to the previous blade. It had also been nourished by a high-level Pangu warrior for more than 30 years and was also a 9-patterned weapon. Moreover, while following the high-level Pangu warrior for many years, it had drank the blood of many formidable life forms and had transformed into a baleful weapon. When such a rare weapon which excited many people was brought out, it was foreordained that there would be a fierce competition to acquire it. The hatchet finally sold for 1,380,000 Pangu sacred coins and was obtained by the formidable Ba Wang. Li Yunmyo thought about competing for a few times, but in the end, he suppressed that urge once more. Yet the following 9 items in the auction were all surprisingly 9 and 10 patterned Pangu weapons, which caused many people to feel that something was odd. Could the food have grown so scarce that year that they didn't hesitate to even auction so many of their customized weapons? Although no sage-grade weapons had appeared, the auctioning of several 9 and 10 patterned ordinary-grade weapons was already an event which happened only once in a century. After all, which of the 10 ordinary-grade weapons hadn't been nourished by a high-level Pangu warrior for at least 10 years? Probably even the Pangu soldiers couldn't get a hold of them, so where could they find a surplus to sell to outsiders? And yet the Pangu had auctioned off 10 such weapons for food. It reflected just how horrible was the food situation that year. After the bidders obtained the 10 Pangu weapons, the auction entered the free sale segment. During it, the Pangu wouldn't be officiating the auction, but would allow the people who had come from all around the world to take out their valuable possessions and auction them. Originally, Li Yunmyo had believed that after sell-off of the treasures from the treasury of Black Spirit Valley, he possessed sufficient funds to fight in the grand finale of the auction. But after seeing people from Sound as well as all sorts of other powerful races, he no longer had the confidence to win. Thus, he thought for a while and decided to take out the 10 treasure maps which were comparatively useless to him and auction them off systematically in the free sale segment. Chapter 532, Problems with Treasure Maps. Li Yunmyo took out the 10 secret treasure maps. 4 of them showed the way to dimensional spaces which he hadn't yet explored, another 4 detailed the exact geographical location of spirit ingredients, while the last 2 were for special minerals. These were the maps which were relatively less useful to him or with which he could bear to part from the 20-something treasure maps he'd obtained from the treasury. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken them to auction and would have instead went to explore them. Once the 10 secret treasure maps were announced, they caused quite an uproar among the bidders. It was especially so for the 4 maps which contained the location and details regarding 4 unexplored dimensional spaces. They attracted the eyes of many alien races. After all, no one would ever complain that they possessed too many dimensional spaces. Regardless of whether it was a first-tier or a third-tier power, all of them wanted the discovered yet unexploited dimensional spaces which also included the access to all the resources in them. Moreover, the 4 maps of the dimensional spaces didn't have many details apart from the known concrete geographical location. From that, they could guess that the dimensional spaces in the 4 maps probably possessed a lot of valuable space. This fact was certain to drive the prices up. The 4-dimensional spaces which hadn't been explored yet, how much area did they have? Similarly, no one knew what grade of uncommon materials or resources could be found within the 4 unexplored dimensional spaces. They also couldn't tell what sort of rare life forms would exist there. There was the question if life was even possible in those dimensional spaces. Because of that, the value of the 4-dimensional space maps was relatively volatile. If there was no buyer who urgently needed private space, then the insufficient information would lower the prices because the buyers wouldn't want to risk their wealth. But if someone did urgently need more space, the prices could swell to extreme heights. It was all because they possessed unlimited possibilities. There was a chance that they only had a small area and were barren lands in which even the simplest life forms couldn't exist. But at the same time, it was also possible that the dimensional spaces were extremely large and were filled with an astonishing amount of resources. They may even contain extremely high-grade material. Thus, after the Pangu auction house received Li Yunmu's 10 secret treasure maps, it kept dawdling for a long time. Only after a while did they determine a comparatively reasonable price. I have 10 secret treasure maps in my hand, 4 of them were determined to be B grade, 4 C grade, and the last 2 C grade as well. Before the auction master had even finished speaking, he attracted an uproar. Many buyers began talking in whispers. Once Pangu sold several 9-patterned basic weapons to the outsiders, the level of the auction had been raised to an extremely high grade. But when the crowd heard that surprisingly 4 B-grade secret treasure maps were about to be auctioned, the people filled with great interest and expectations. Even if the maps were only classified as B-grade, the items of this level held quite an enormous potential for benefit in the origin world. Do these 4 maps contain the location of unexplored dimensional spaces? Someone underneath the stage couldn't help but guess. That's right. They are precisely that maps which contain the location of unexplored dimensional spaces. The most recent information in the maps is from 45 days ago. Alright, I will now announce the information about the first map. The first unexplored dimensional space is located south of Beatty City in the eastern region. The area of the dimensional space is unknown and the quality of resources inside is also unknown. The grade of life forms in the dimensional space is unknown too, so the base price is 3 million sacred Pangu coins. Every bid must be 100,000 sacred Pangu coins higher than the last bid. The bidding starts now. Although Pangu had learned how to make an auction from humans, their style was extremely crude and direct. Once the prices were announced, they started the auction without wasting any time. However, the base price caused many people to turn silent. Originally, the crowd was filled with excitement and expectations, but it had instantly turned still. All information unknown? Last reliable news from 45 days ago? 3 million sacred Pangu coins as base price? Each one of the above-mentioned information dampened the fervent excitement in most people. Buying that map was equal to gambling. Even if there was no detailed information about the size of the dimensional space, it would have still been all right. But if the level of life forms inside was completely unknown, many people would instantly want to examine carefully whether their group or power had the strength required to exploit the resources. The gamble, which relied on spending a lot of money to obtain a dimensional space about which no one knew anything, was extremely risky. If the dimensional space was in ruins, it would be a great loss. It made people worry, especially when they heard that the last valid information was from 45 days ago. What did this signify? It meant that the owner had stopped keeping track of the dimensional space. A period of 1.5 months could be considered as very long or very short. If during that time the dimensional space had been discovered and exploited by other people, what would happen then? It would be a disastrous loss. Because of the above-mentioned reasons, the bidders' enthusiasm immediately cooled off. At this time, Li Yunmu tensed up slightly. Originally, he hadn't intended to take those maps out for auction. Before, he'd thought that even if he couldn't explore them for the time being, he would rather let them rot in his hands than sell any unexplored dimensional spaces. After all, once he explored them and was acknowledged as their master, he could do as he wished. Even if he chose to auction them, their price wouldn't be as low as a few millions. It would shoot up to 10 or maybe even 100 times higher amount. If the dimensional space he encountered was large, possessed a lot of resources, and was livable, it was possible that the prices would swell more than 1,000 times. After all, it would also included the prices of all the resources in the dimensional space. However, Li Yunmu wanted to get his hands on the Pangu true armor, so he didn't make any bids on other items and even took out his precious maps to auction with great unwillingness. If he'd known it would come to that, he would have taken them out for auction earlier, when the date of the last checkup was closer. The base price wouldn't have been so low then. Chapter 533, Auctioning Maps. 3,500,000. Although nothing was known about the dimensional space and the last information was from 45 days ago, one of the several alien races couldn't help but take the bite. It's someone from the Devil Scorpion. The bidder's alien race was Devil Scorpion. Its comprehensive strength was lay in the middle of the 1,000 races. Li Yunmu followed the bidder's voice with a hopeful gaze and couldn't help but be slightly astounded. The man's appearance startled him a bit. God only knew what sort hardcore taste the deities of ancient times had to have created such an alien race. Li Yunmu had to accept that the appearance of the Devil Scorpions was somewhat astonishing. It fit well with their name. On first glance, he could see that they were an extreme combination of human and scorpion. They possessed the arms and legs of humans, but were covered in scorpion armor from top to bottom. At their backs was a long and thick tail similar to that of a black scorpion. Even their faces were covered with densely packed scales. Li Yunmu couldn't dare to imagine how the deities of ancient times had thought of creating such a bloodline from the combination of humans and monsters. But although his shock wasn't small, their classification as an alien race wasn't without reason. With their knowledge, culture, and society, they were clearly similar to humans. Although their appearance was that of monsters, they could still be considered as a civilized race. So the Devil Scorpions are bidding. But then again, it isn't a surprise since their main base is located near Beatty City. It's worth it for them. Soon, someone gave a quick introduction of Devil Scorpions. Although the auctioneer had publicly announced the treasure map's geographical location, the origin world was a vast place. The southern side of Beatty City of Eastern region was an extremely huge region. Without the precise location, trying to find the dimensional space's location was tantamount to looking for a needle in a haystack. This was why Li Yunmu had allowed the Pangu official to share this information. As a matter of fact, wasn't it precisely because of the rough geographical location that he had encountered a local bidder who desired it greatly? 3,800,000. Although the auction began with an awkward silence, the moment Beatty City's local power Devil Scorpions made a bid, another person made the next bid. This one didn't come from one of the alien races, but rather a masked human powerhouse. Based on the presence coming from the man's body, he was a late-stage sage flux expert. Such a formidable human powerhouse instantly attracted the attention of many people. A super powerhouse with the strength of a late-stage sage flux expert in the origin world wasn't like Earth's domain sages. Based on the comparison of power levels among the two worlds, this human powerhouse's strength was comparable to that of the invincible battle sages. Even among the 1,000 races of the origin world, this was enough to call the person a powerhouse. Pangu True Armor had attracted many characters with terrifying strength which instantly pressured Li Yunmu even more. Even with his comprehensive combat strength, he might be able to battle and flee from a mid-stage sage flux expert, but he was still quite far away from battling a battle sage level character. This disparity was similar to the difference between domain and battle sages on Earth. Although it was just a difference of a minor realm, the former couldn't put up any resistance against the latter in a life and death battle. But despite that, the Devil Scorpions didn't have any great apprehensions toward the late-stage sage flux expert. One of their people clenched his teeth and announced the bid of 4 million. Instantly, most of the people on the scene began to ponder. A glimmer of light flashed through the eyes of many. The abnormal behavior of Devil Scorpions and their strong desire to compete caused the hypothesis of many people to become stronger. None of the characters present in the auction were idiots. Since the Devil Scorpions who had their base near Beatty City thirsted for the secret treasure map, it answered many of their questions. They were now certain that the information about the dimensional space was still useful. If it had been discovered by someone else, would the Devil Scorpions bother to compete in the bidding? The answer was no. Thus, the auction of the treasure map about which many people weren't optimistic grew exciting all of a sudden. In a flash, many bidders who were originally watching silently joined the competition. 5 million, 5,300,000, 6 million, 7 million, finally the bid reached 12 million sacred Pangu coins. Li Yunmu was quite surprised by this price. Even an idiot could understand from this that the dimensional space at the location provided in the map was definitely an extremely valuable one. In the end, the secret treasure map was bought by the reckless devil scorpions who had started the bidding for the outrageous price of 18 million sacred Pangu coins. It caused an uproar, and everyone's eyes filled with various thoughts. As for the seller Li Lunmu, he now clearly understood that the dimensional space shown in the treasure map was of great value. The devil scorpions seemed to know about it from some private records, but he still didn't regret selling it to them. The reason for that was quite simple, and it was that even the most valuable dimensional space couldn't compare to the increase of his personal strength and importance. As long as he possessed the right amount of strength, what sort of benefit could he not snatch? This was analogous to the situation a while ago. If Li Yunmu hadn't gained the substantial boost in strength from the innate expert armor, it would have been more or less impossible for him to single-handedly kill his way across a third-tier power. Without that, how could he have been able to come to Pangu City and trade away the astonishing treasures? Soon, the 18 million sacred Pangu coins flowed into Li Yunmu's hands, increasing his chances to get his hands on the true armor. After that, the 9 other secret treasure maps were sold in succession one after another. The second map was auctioned for 4,500,000 sacred Pangu coins, the third map was sold for 7 million sacred Pangu coins, while the fourth map was passed upon. Even if its base price was the lowest of the 4, only 1,300,000, not one person made any bid for it. Li Yunmu couldn't understand it at first, but Wang Ren's explanation quickly cleared everything up. It wasn't that the location specified in the treasure map wasn't valuable, but that everyone was extremely fearful of the consequences if they dared to go there. The location specified in the map was in the territory of Luo devils. What sort of alien race were these Luo devils? If truth was told, Li Yunmu wasn't too familiar with this extremely formidable alien race which loved to war. If went to inquire about them from the people of other formidable races, he would have learned that they were all extremely apprehensive of Luo devils. And the dimensional space of the fourth map was located right in their territory. This explained why even if the map had the lowest price, no one dared to bid for it. After all, no one wanted their dimensional space to be located in the territory of that formidable and savage alien race. Chapter 534, Spirit Grade Serpent Egg. The other 6 secret treasure maps were also auctioned for an impressive price. Of the 2 treasure maps pertaining to uncommon mineral resources, one was auctioned for the high price of 1,600,000. The other was quite inferior to the first one and was only auctioned for a price of 30,000. The reason was for it was simple: the uncommon mineral resources from the secret treasure map weren't located in a good place. The surrounding environment was filled with formidable, vicious and even giant beasts. It thus was the reason for the disparity in price between the 2 treasure maps. As for the 4 treasure maps containing the information about spirit ingredients, they were sold for 6 million in total. Each map had averaged to 1,500,000. But even so, the profits from the auction surpassed Li Yunmu's expectations by far. He had obtained 31,600,000 Pangu sacred coins, and given Pangu City's conversion rate, it was tantamount to 31,600,000 tons of food grain. The sacred Pangu coins created by the Pangu had the price of 1 ton of grain as the lowest unit. As the price of grain changed in the origin world, the conversion rate of sacred Pangu coins also changed. If the 31,600,000 sacred Pangu coins were changed to contribution points used between human cultivators, the conversion would result in close to 20 million points. After deducting the 10% service change, Li Yunmu would have close to 17 million contribution points once he converted his gains. If he combined it with the 35 million contribution points obtained from selling the numerous weapons and other resources from the treasury of Black Spirit Valley, his wealth would easily surpass 50 million. In fact, the exact amount would be 53 million contribution points. What sort of enormous wealth was this? The price of a flux binding pill was 300 contribution points, making it extremely hard for the ordinary cultivators to cultivate by using them. Yet with the amount of contribution points Li Yunmu now possessed, he could buy 18,000 flux binding pills. Assuming that a flux expert required 300 flux binding pills to cultivate to great flux expert realm, his enormous amount of contribution points would be enough to nurture 588 great flux experts. What did this wealth signify? Under ordinary circumstances, even if a third-tier power had pretty good comprehensive strength, the number of great flux experts it could nurture wouldn't surpass 30 on a good day. If the number of great flux experts surpassed 100, this reserve power would rise like a pillar of light in the darkness. It would be enough for the third-tier power to pass the threshold to become a second-tier sect. Blue Moon Island, which Li Yunmu had infiltrated previously, had been a third-tier power, and it had only had 20-something great flux experts. But once Li Yunmu changed the objects from the treasury of Black Spirit Valley to wealth, his riches already far surpassed the amount of wealth in the hands of a third-tier power. This once again confirmed Li Yunmu's idea that Black Spirit Valley, which was a third-tier power in a corner of the world, had definitely obtained and excavated some precious minerals. Otherwise, how could they have amassed such an enormous amount of treasures in their treasury? It had even gotten hold of unique treasures such as the Red God Fruit, as well as one of the 3 divine artifacts created by the Master Refiner of Dias. But all of this wasn't important to Li Yunmu. He also wasn't idle enough to go and investigate what sort of happy encounter had Black Spirit Valley encountered. All he cared about was that all those objects had fallen into his hands. After the 9 secret treasure maps had been auctioned, other buyers also auctioned all sorts of objects from all around the origin world. The products brought by some alien races were often things which Li Yunmu hadn't heard of or seen in his life. The auction had truly broadened his horizons. If he wasn't forced to control his urge to bid so as to save money for the final item, the true armor, he would have made a dozen bids long ago. Next, this item was brought by our guest from Heavenly Cats. It is a spirit-grade breeding egg of an unknown beast from Serpent class. After several authentications, this breeding egg was ascertained to belong to spirit grade. Alright, it has the base price of 8 million sacred Pangu coins. An increase cannot be smaller than 100,000. The auction begins. After his words, a female Pangu warrior on the stage lifted up a red cloth from the item in her hands and revealed an egg flickering mildly. When Li Yunmu saw the unknown serpent class egg, which was at least spirit grade or higher, he was incomparably astonished. It has to be known that it was an egg which was supposed to be spirit grade or higher. For a long time, Li Yunmu had wanted a beast which could act as his mount. After all, the origin world was vast. Even if there were teleport channels which made movement between distant regions more convenient, it wasn't the same as having a personal mount. Constant teleportations were very time-consuming, and he'd only be able to go to places which had the necessary infrastructure. After all, the teleport channels were only in the most important places. It was impossible to lay them down everywhere. Thus, if cultivators possessed a mount with great endurance and extremely fast speed, it would be very beneficial for them. When Li Yunmu's strength was low and before he had entered the Great Flux Expert realm, he hadn't been impatient to fulfill this need. But once his strength increased to the level at which he could be counted among the powerhouses of the origin world, he became increasingly more aware that he had to come into possession of a mount or combat beast of his own. But he didn't forget his main goal for coming to the auction, and as always in the past, he continued to endure his urge to bid. However, while Li Yunmu was thinking in this manner, it didn't mean that others would also do so. It has to be known that it was the egg of a spirit-grade beast. If it hatched successfully, it would mean that the unknown serpent egg could mature and become a devil-grade beast at the least. In terms of human strength, this was equivalent to sage flux experts. This was an extremely rare treasure which could only be encountered once in 100 years, and the heartbeat of many genuine powerhouses sped up. Although the price of 8 million sacred Pangu coins was very high, it was unable to stop the genuine powerhouses from bidding. Soon, the bid for the unknown serpent egg rose up, and before long, it reached an astonishing level. 13 million, going once. Before the auctioneer could finish speaking, a person under the stage raised their pedal and said indifferently, 15 million. The sudden jump of 2 million instantly caused even people like Lee Yun-myu, whose minds weren't on the bidding, to snap to attention and concentrate on the auction. It's her again, one of the sound women. Lee Yun-myu shook his head, and a hint of bitterness appeared in his heart. If the two weren't from one of the races which were used by deists to produce offspring. Chapter 535, Abnormal. The reality was the same either way. Even if the sound women were only used by deists for carrying their offspring, the extremely high price as well as the calm voice instantly caused the fierce competition among the bidders to calm down. However, before long, another voice raised the price to 16 million. Perhaps the sound women, which were under the protection of deists, could intimidate many people and alien races on the scene. There were still many formidable people who didn't fear their backer or their financial resources. Soon, the price of the serpent egg rose to close to 20 million. Lee Yun-myu became apprehensive, but even he didn't feel that this was a high price. If he wasn't targeting Pangu true armor, he wouldn't have held back and tried to get his hands on the spirit-grade serpent egg. An egg of such level was a lot different from treasures. The latter was a non-living object which could only increase the strength of cultivators by a certain amount. The egg, however, meant that as long as the hatched life form reached adulthood, it would become a combat beast with the strength of a sage flux expert. While Lee Yun-myu was marveling at the capital of the other alien races, his complexion changed. At some time, God Flowing Wind had quietly appeared at his side. Why did you come out? Do I need to spell it out for you that you mustn't underestimate the people of this world, especially here in the territory of Pangu? Lee Yun-myu creased his brows and scolded him via the connection between the two of them without making any movements. Master Yun-myu, I am also not fond of taking unnecessary risks by showing myself, but you must certainly find a way to get your hands on this unknown serpent's egg, God Flowing Wind said in a hurry. After he had cultivated the infant soul preservation to minor threshold, his mortal soul had reached an extremely high level, and the fact that he was a soul wouldn't be found out so easily. But even so, Lee Yun-myu still didn't dare to reveal this portion of an ancient god's soul to everyone. Otherwise, if this fact was found out by someone, it would be catastrophic for Lee Yun-myu. That was why, although God Flowing Wind had great knowledge about the items being auctioned, Lee Yun-myu still made him hide within a treasure where his presence as a soul-type life form would be unnoticeable. God Flowing Wind could release a hint of awareness and sense the spirit-grade treasures being auctioned. Yet Lee Yun-myu hadn't expected that the spirit-grade serpent egg would attract his attention. What was the soul up to now? Once he heard that God Flowing Wind wanted him to think of a way to get his hands on the serpent egg, he became slightly angry. What are you thinking? Between the serpent egg and Pangu true armor, we can only obtain one. Lee Yun-myu couldn't control the shock he felt and took another look at the unknown serpent egg. He actually couldn't imagine what sort of qualifications or special characteristics it had for God Flowing Wind to act in such a manner. It was completely unexpected as well as through their previous plan to the side. The ancient god's soul fragment was actually wanted him to get his hands on this serpent egg. Serpent egg. After Lee Yun-myu asked him to choose one of the two, God Flowing Wind clenched his teeth and told him to renounce the Pangu true armor. This. Lee Yun-myu's mind was instantly thrown into chaos. It has to be known that the auction of Pangu true armor was an opportunity which was extremely difficult to come by. Moreover, Pangu true armor would allow his innate expert armor to evolve to the next step. Could this spirit-grade egg of an unknown serpent beast do the same? Just when he was thinking about asking why he had changed his intention just before the battle, God Flowing Wind spoke with alarm. Not good, that White Feather's member has a probing tool. He almost discovered me. I am escaping. Remember, you must get your hands on that serpent egg. Before the words could fade away, Lee Yun-myu sensed his presence disappear. The ancient god's soul fragment didn't dare to stay in the secret treasure and instead returned straight to the heavenly world, completely removing his presence from the outside world. Sure enough, the keen senses of the portion of soul separated from the ancient god were correct. After Li Yunmu focused on the auction after the exchange with God Flowing Wind, he sensed a formless presence. Two white lights suddenly shot from the eyes of the dais protecting the sound woman. The dais wantonly swept his surroundings, but God Flowing Wind had sensed the crisis a step in advance and had already returned to the heavenly world. Thus, the probing of the dais didn't yield any results. But he was still unwilling to give up and swept the whole auction house with his eyes, which had light resembling an electric flash. He still couldn't discover anything, and a slightly perplexed expression appeared on his face before he chose to drop it. Dais were tyrannical. If Li Yunmu hadn't personally witnessed this scene, he wouldn't have known that this race ranked as the most powerful among the 1,000 races was so dominant. Even an ordinary individual among them possessed strength to which other races would find hard to compare themselves. Li Yunmu knew that the white feathers mentioned by God Flowing Wind were actually the dais. This was because in the ancient times, that was their name. Clearly, they hadn't possessed the strength and status back then to take up this name. Regardless of how it was, after Li Yunmu saw that God Flowing Wind hadn't hesitated to take the risk of exposing himself for the Serpent Egg, he knew what he had to do. He immediately adjusted his mental state, and after choosing another goal, he raised his pedal and indifferently announced a number under Wang Ren's astonished gaze. 30 million. Boom. It was the first time Li Yunmu made a bid, and it was like a bomb dropped on the originally tranquil scene. From 20 million sacred Pangu coins, all of a sudden, a nobody like him who didn't look that old had raised the price by 7 million. Instantly, the formidable experts of alien races as well as powerful human characters from all around the world raised their eyebrows. Li Yunmu suddenly raising the price by 7 million sacred Pangu coins had instantly caused the people taking part in the bid to turn silent for a long time. Just when Li Yunmu was thinking that he had won, the charming voice of the sound woman echoed in the room. Interesting, I only thought of this egg as a spirit-grade toy with some potential, but since this young smarta views it with such importance, maybe this unknown serpent egg has some special characteristics. Chapter 536, the final item appears. Before the young woman's words could fade, the other woman from sound raised her pedal into the air. F***C.K. Upon seeing it, Li Yunmu couldn't help but secretly curse her in his heart. If she wanted to bid, she should bid. Why was she trying to trick people with lies? It was clearly a spirit-grade animal egg, so how could it have turned into something extraordinary or special just by him bidding on it? At that instant, Li Yunmu hated the young sound woman to death for disrupting the situation. In reality, even if it was a spirit-grade beast egg of serpent type with unknown nature, there was still a certain amount of risk involved. It was impossible to know if it possessed an evolved bloodline. That was why when Li Yunmu raised the price to 30 million in one breath, the powerhouses of the other races began to hesitate about whether to renounce or continue with bidding. The price of 30 million sacred Pangu coins surpassed the worth of a spirit-grade beast egg, even if it possessed an evolved bloodline. The majority of the people looked towards the married sound woman and then at Li Yunmu, who was sitting motionless. The powerhouses who were intending to continue bidding saw the determined expressions on the faces of the two and decided to renounce. 35 million. Although the powerhouses had backed off, this didn't mean that Li Yunmu had also given up. The young sound woman was attentively watching his expression. But it was useless, since Li Yunmu had a poker face. He wasn't smiling or showing any anger, there simply weren't any emotions on his face. This made it difficult for everyone to guess the thoughts of this youngster who had suddenly started bidding. As a matter of fact, the strategy of using a taut face had been prepared by Li Yunmu for when he bid on the Pangu True Armor. Using such a tactic would allow him to hide his thoughts from everyone else. Li Yunmu didn't react to the young woman's words, making everyone even more perplexed about why he was willing to spend such a high amount of money and continue participating in the bidding war for the serpent beast egg. 36 million. Li Yunmu followed up without any hesitation, raising the price by another 4 million in one stroke. But the increase of 4 million sacred Pangu coins didn't faze the young sound woman. She instead found it even more amusing and increased the price by 1,000,000. 50 million. Boom. At this time, Li Yunmu didn't follow convention and increased the price not by 4 million or 7 million, but full 14 million. Everyone raised their eyebrows, and the auction officials grew excited. They were no longer able to hide their fervent gazes aimed at Li Yunmu. Ruthless, this single word rose in the minds of everyone present. They had encountered a truly ruthless person. If that didn't fit, then he could also be called a maniac. Many people once again looked towards Li Yunmu to check his expression. They wanted to understand why he was willing to throw so much money on the spirit-grade beast egg. But the people on the scene were disappointed. Even if Li Yunmu had ferociously raised the price by 14 million sacred Pangu coins, his expression didn't change in the slightest. The young sound woman's complexion turned somewhat unsightly at that moment. Li Yunmu's way of spending wealth finally left her speechless. Even if the young sound woman was wealthier, she didn't want to get entangled with a maniac. She covered her mouth and smiled, withdrawing the half-raised petal after thinking for a long while. Spirit-grade unknown serpent beast egg for 50 million, going once? Going twice? And sold. When the auction master struck the hammer the final time and declared that the serpent beast egg was finally sold to Li Yunmu, he secretly breathed a sigh of relief. He had finally got his hands on the serpent beast egg. Yet for it, he had thrown away all his resources and could no longer compete in bidding for the grand finale, the Pangu true armor. But despite having his suspicions, Li Yunmu didn't repent. Since God Flowing Wind had taken such a big risk to personally show up, it was without a doubt that the serpent beast egg was extraordinary. Naturally, being a spirit-grade object, it was already considered extraordinary. But Li Yunmu knew that it was even more extraordinary than an extraordinary treasure. Pangu's auction was very efficient. Before long, the serpent beast egg was delivered to Li Yunmu. With all the powerhouses watching him attentively, he placed it into his storage badge without even glancing at it. "This handsome young man, don't you want to take a look at the spirit-grade serpent beast egg which you purchased for 50 million? The devilishly charming voice of the young sound woman came from the front of the auction hall. However, Li Yunmu stayed silent while looking at her with a profound gaze. The less one spoke, the less mistakes they would make. At that moment, Li Yunmu was fully immersed in playing the role of a silent and mysterious youngster. Regardless of how many times the young sound woman tried to initiate conversation with him, he acted like a stone statue. After that, more than 10 objects were auctioned, including rare treasures from all races. Li Yunmu didn't know whether there was something like the serpent beast egg among them because God Flowing Wind had already returned to the heavenly world. But he wasn't too disappointed, since he had squandered away all his wealth already. Thus, he remained completely calm. If he didn't want to personally lay his eyes on the legendary Pangu true armor, then probably, he would have already returned from the auction. Finally, after a long time, the grand finale for which everyone had been waiting began. A few female Pangu warriors appeared while cautiously holding a true armor flickering with dark golden light. At that instant, a hint of intoxication appeared in the eyes all the bidders participating in the auction. Everyone faintly sensed holiness and bloodthirstiness, two opposite presences coming from the true armor. Instantly, someone who had previously come in contact with the Pangu true armor couldn't help but speak with madness in his eyes. "This presence, that's right, this is a true and authentic Pangu true armor. I really hadn't expected that the Pangu would consent to selling it to outsiders." Even Li Yunmu, who had put up a poker face, couldn't help but feel a hint of regret after laying his eyes on the legendary Pangu true armor. In a single glance, he understood how formidable was the true armor. The rumored supreme treasure of the Pangu truly outdid itself. There were ordinary, sage, and true weapons. Clearly, it was a 12-patterned Pangu true armor, so what exactly was its origin? Speaking of which, Pangu true armor was considered as an extremely rare treasure among Pangu because it could only be formed by their powerhouses. After a great circle sage flux expert who had half a step into deity realm and had cultivated a formidable body reached nirvana, the armor could be extracted. You hadn't read wrong, this was the origin of the 12-patterned Pangu true armor congealed from the flesh and blood of a Pangu powerhouse with half step in deity realm. In the entire race, the number of people who possessed 12-patterned armor perhaps wouldn't surpass 10. Then what circumstances could have forced the Pangu to auction one to outsider? Chapter 537, The Sudden Change in Heavenly Cat's Plan. The armor was the main target of all alien races as well as the human powerhouses who had hurried over from all regions. That was why Li Yunmu's previous concerns about whether his 53 million contribution points would be sufficient or not to clinch the deal weren't without reason. Since the Pangu had decided to obtain even more grain and had even taken out a precious treasure like the Pangu true armor to be auctioned to outsiders, the base price was also determined to be at 30 million sacred Pangu coins. This was a price which even ordinary sage flux experts would find difficulty in procuring. However, it was only a starting price for all the races and powerhouses gathered in the auction house. The supreme treasure of my race with 12 patterns has the base price of 30 million. The following bid shouldn't be lower than 1 million sacred Pangu coins. The bidding begins now. The auctioneer had barely finished speaking when the bidders began to raise bids in succession. Before even the time required to drink a cup of tea passed, the price of 30 million had jumped to 50 million. Before long, it went from 50 million to 70 million sacred Pangu coins. Li Yunmu felt quite depressed regarding this. In a flash, with everyone staking their all in bidding, the price had quickly surpassed the limits of his wealth. Even if he sold the 9 treasure maps at the last moment, which allowed his wealth to rise to 53 million contribution points, it wasn't enough. If the amount was converted to sacred Pangu coins, it would be a bit over 70 million sacred Pangu coins. Inwardly, he felt somewhat fortunate for obtaining the Serpent Beast Egg. Otherwise, even if he had all his capital with him, he would have been just a minor character with his 70 million sacred Pangu coins when every race's formidable powerhouses were competing over the armor. There was no one to blame for it, since his measly wealth couldn't compare with the profound reserves of the bidders. What a pity, given how formidable my innate expert armor is. If I could have absorbed this true armor, my defenses might have reached an indestructible level. Li Yunmu sighed with regret. Before him was a treasure which could have boosted his combat strength. Even if the true armor couldn't evolve his Azure Dragon expert armor to the next stage, it still would have been greatly beneficial to him. Unwillingness flashed through Li Yunmu's eyes. But he still didn't show anything on his face and waited until the final winner of the true armor appeared. The price of 70 million sacred Pangu coins was only the warm-up. As increasingly more low-profile mysterious bidders began to bid, and the price of the 12-patterned Pangu true armor continued to rise. It went to 80 million, 90 million, 122 million, a familiar voice shouted out. The young sound woman was among the final 4 powerful competitors. Apparently, obtaining the true armor was a must for her. When she had been bidding with Li Yunmu on the spirit-grade Serpent Beast Egg, it wasn't actually for real since her true aim for coming to the auction was another item. Her real goal was to get her hands on the true armor. 123 million. Ba Wang firmly clenched their teeth, and a member from their group stood up under the gazes of everyone to announce the new price. However, few in the crowd were optimistic about their chances. It wasn't that they weren't optimistic about the strength of one of the top 10 most powerful races, but they didn't think highly of their financial power. As a matter of fact, the price had already reached an extremely ridiculous stage. 130 million. The heavenly cats once again increased the price to a new height. The unknown heavenly cats were shining brightly in everyone's eyes. No one had expected that they were capable of reaching this stage. After all, the heavenly cat's comprehensive strength was not in the first 100 among the 1,000 known races. They couldn't be regarded as weak, but they definitely couldn't be considered as shining bright. Moreover, in the past several hundred years, the entire race had been very low profile, so no one thought that they would suddenly stand out on that day. 140 million. The young sound woman bid again without any thought to obtain her target. Her actions clearly illustrated the enormous financial ability of the sound. The matrilineal sound might be weak, but their innate talent in making musical instruments made sure that they were always overflowing with wealth. Naturally, if the sound could only manufacture musical instruments used by ordinary people to enjoy themselves, they definitely couldn't have amassed enormous wealth. But since heavens made it so that only they could create musical instruments which were effective for cultivators, they were quite popular. It was an ability unique to their race. If they hadn't received the protection of deities, however, this weak race wouldn't have been allowed to exist. After all, they didn't have strength but possessed the ability to make a lot of wealth. This would have naturally invited a disaster upon them. Li Yunmu had finally experienced the tremendous financial power of the sound. Just a single young woman forced everyone in the auction to lose all hope. Sound didn't have power but possessed enough wealth to rival an entire nation. 150 million. The heavenly cats were quite tenacious. They were the only ones still competing with the sound woman. If Li Yunmu hadn't remembered wrong, then the spirit-grade serpent beast egg which he had just bought from auction had been brought by the three heavenly cats. No one could have expected that they were this determined to obtain the true armor. Ha ha ha, I truly hadn't anticipated the low-key heavenly cats would also possess such wealth. The young yin woman laughed lightly and lifted up the petal without paying any attention to it. 180 million sacred Pangu coins. When the young sound woman called out this price, the sound of sharp inhales echoed through the entire auction hall. Li Yunmu raised his head and looked at the woman with a bitter smile. Although he had believed that after robbing Black Spirit Valley he had become wealthy overnight, it seemed like he was still a small player among the genuine high-level characters. 180 million, going once, 180 million going twice, and sold. In the end, the three heavenly cats suffered a defeat after the young sound woman made her final bid. The fierce increase of 30 million sacred Pangu coins had broken the competitors' willpower. This was an extremely enormous amount of money. 180 million sacred Pangu coins, what did this imply? This amount of wealth was enough to nurture the number of great flux experts required to cross the threshold of a second-tier power and even be known as one of the most powerful ones. But it had been used to win a 12-patterned Pangu true armor. Li Yunmu didn't know whether it was worth it or not, but if he'd had this much money, he definitely wouldn't have hesitated to throw it at the auction. Given the defense and strength of the Azure Dragon expert armor, his strength would rise to the next level if he assimilated a 12-patterned, incomparable true armor. With such strength, Li Yunmu would become even less afraid of consequences in the origin world. It would have definitely been worth it for him, but he didn't have this sort of money. Thus, everyone, including Li Yunmu and the heavenly cats, could only watch helplessly as the sound woman snatched the unique true armor. Everyone thought that the auction was done, but suddenly everything changed. Attack! One of the three heavenly Ka shouted out fiercely. It was a surprise attack. In the end moments of the auction, the heavenly cats attacked to snatch the Pangu true armor. Upon seeing that, all the people present thought that the heavenly cats had gone crazy, completely crazy. They had surprisingly dared to attack with the intention to steal a supreme armor sold in an auction in Pangu City. This caught everyone off guard. After all, no one normally dared to court disaster by choosing this path. Yet the heavenly cats, which weren't very powerful, did just that. With it, they showed that they had gone completely mad. Chapter 538, The situation changes again. No one had expected such an action right when the auction seemed to have ended. What are they doing? How could they even dare? Where did they get the guts for something like that? The majority of people in the crowd were stupefied. It had to be known that they were all in Pangu City. It was a territory of the race which ranked as the fifth most powerful among the 1,000 races in terms of bloodline strength. In the land of such terrifying people, even the indisputable kings of the origin world, the deities, wouldn't have the courage to steal the Pangu true armor, let alone heavenly cats which ranked below the first 500 in terms of strength. Yet it was exactly what had happened. With that single order as a warning, the 3 heavenly cats suddenly rose from their seats and rushed toward the auction stage at a speed of thunder. They aimed straight for the Pangu true armor won by the young sound woman. What are they doing? Heavenly cats, you are courting death. Since the auction was in their territory, the Pangu hadn't brought many guards in case the bidders decided to attack. They had believed that it was completely unnecessary and that no one would dare to cause trouble in their land. Yet the sudden change in situation forced the 2 Pangu experts on the stage to respond. The 2 Kuangpan warriors immediately jumped in front of the true armor and slashed toward the heads of the 3 heavenly cats, who were pouncing in their direction, with 2 similarly large Pangu hatchets. Although the defense of the auction wasn't great because of the careless thinking that no one would dare to cause trouble, the 2 men were Kuangpan warriors. They had 10 patterned or higher grade weapons, so they were sufficiently formidable. Pangu warriors were separated into Gupan, Kuangpan, and Shengpan warriors. The 2 guards were Kuangpan warriors, which in human terms were great flux experts. However, the 2 high-level Kuangpan warriors with 10 patterned hatchets were comparable to 2 10th-rank Great Circle Great Flux experts who were half a step into the Sage realm. Although the 2 hatchets which the 2 warriors possessed weren't as ferocious as the ones sold in the auction, they weren't far from them. The 2 10-patterned weapons were among the Sage-grade weapons, since they were above 8 patterns. At that instant, the 2 warriors lifted their hands, and even Li Yunmu, who was sitting far away, was enveloped in the threatening intent of their pincer attack. Before Li Yunmu had devoured the red god fruit, which allowed his flesh and great sun tyrant body refining secrets to reach a major threshold, he would have had no other option but to move his head to avoid the threatening intent from the 10-patterned Kuangpan warriors' hatchets. But the next moment everyone was left astonished. Once the attacks of the 3 heavenly cats and 10-patterned Kuangpan warriors met, a loud boom rang out. 2 fierce chops filled with violent killing intent were forced back by the heavenly cats with petite bodies. Moreover, the power from their attacks hadn't diminished and sent the 2 bulky warriors into the wall. Not good, these 3 are sage cats. With one attack, both of the 10-patterned Kuangpan warriors were blown away. Everyone, including Li Yunmu, instantly realized the strength and cultivation of the 3 heavenly cats. Sage Realm. The heavenly cats had surprisingly dispatched 3 sage-level experts. They were among the very few powerhouses of the heavenly cats which were ranked below the first 100 among the 1,000 races. Clearly, regardless of whether someone was a sage cat, Shengpan, or sage flux expert, all of them were just different names for the sage realm given by different races. The 3 sage flux experts wouldn't be considered as a great force for humans, but for the heavenly cats which were ranked below the first 100 among the 1,000 races, it was a very formidable force. "Let's move," one of the 3 sage cats loudly shouted after succeeding in the counterattack. Such a sudden change had left even the Pangu auction master without any initiative, since the Pangu had never believed that someone would dare to act like this in their own territory. But how could the young sound woman be willing to watch calmly as others robbed her? "Quick, stop those 3 daring fools from that lowly race." The young sound woman was certainly not going to allow the Pangu true armor which could already be classified as hers to be stolen by others. She only needed to stop the 3 sage cats for a short while, then the genuine powerhouses of Pangu would rush over and she would not need to do anything more. The Pangu would definitely not tolerate others running amok in their territory. "Humph, 3 gutsy fools, even daring to rob the dais, just leave them to me." As soon as the young sound woman's charming voice echoed in the auction hall, the dais, who had not allowed anyone to sense his presence, finally took action. Everyone only saw a white flash, and the dais had already cut off the path of escape for the 3 crazily retreating sage cats. In a blink of an eye, the 4 of them entered a high-speed combat, and a series of peng, 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 peng sounds echoed in the auction hall. Within a few breaths, the 4 of them had already exchanged more than 100 attacks. Surprisingly though, the three sage cats couldn't take even half a step forward despite fighting together. The dais had barred their path of retreat all by himself. Li Yunmu took in a deep breath. Was this the legendary bloodline considered as unmatchable under the heavens? He was finally able to sense the young dais during his exchange with the three sage cats. Just like Li Yunmu, the dais youth had recently advanced to sage realm. Yet with only his personal strength, he was able to intercept the three sage cats with complete ease. Only now, after personally experiencing it, did Li Yunmu gain a profound understanding of how terrifying was the dais bloodline. It has to be known that of the three sage cats, two were mid-stage and only one was at the initial stage. Despite that, the dais youth who had recently entered sage realm was easily able to intercept and stop the three while battling on his own. Just when all the clients believed that the sage cats were stopped, the situation changed again. A sudden storm broke out in the auction hall. Chapter 539, The True Target. From the crowd, two devil pythons suddenly stood up and rushed forward. However, they weren't aiming for the object which was the center of everyone's attention, the Pangu true armor. Instead, they went for the young sound woman who had previously been protected by the dais youth. In lieu of this sudden change in the situation, Li Yunmu instantly sensed some major affair about to happen. The true goal of the two groups was probably not to snatch the Pangu true armor and run away, but to assassinate the young sound woman. And at that instant, the young dais was late with his reaction. The three sage cat powerhouses joined their hands to attack him, but this time, their aim wasn't to escape but to slow him down so he wouldn't be able to return to the woman. Ah, save me quickly! Color drained from the face of the young sound woman. The two devil pythons emitting killing intent had already leaped in front of her. The dais youth was more than 10 meters away and was being obstructed from being able to help her. Li Yunmu could already tell that the furious young sound woman was going to die without any doubt. And he was not the only one with such thoughts. The people from the other alien races and those who had conducted the auction were also certain that she couldn't be rescued. This was truly pulling the carpet from under her. Someone had used the three heavenly cat powerhouses to target the Pangu true armor, which was bound to attract the attention of the dais youth so the two devil pythons who were lying in wait could have an opportunity to attack. Li Yunmu checked the strength of the two devil pythons, and they were both great flux experts. Even if they wouldn't be higher than the 5th rank, this level of strength was sufficient. After all, there were only a few maids around the sound woman who were from the same race and could provide no protection. The sound maids were just a joke. Everyone, including Li Yunmu, simply ignored their existence. After all, everyone was clear that there weren't many high-level powerhouses among the sound. Given their weak innate bloodline, there wouldn't be more than 10 great flux experts among all of their people. But the next instant, everyone found out that they were mistaken. Take a hike, how could our queen be assassinated by little kittens and snakes like you? The moment the young sound woman was in imminent peril, one of the maids took action. Li Yunmu couldn't even clearly see her moves. A cold light flashed, and the two formidable devil pythons who were aggressively rushing over suddenly lost all the drive. That was due to them being dead. The assassins who had attacked without any warning were killed by a single maid. What guts, daring to deceive me! You're all courting death. After the assassination failed, the dais youth breathed a sigh of relief and grew furious. The assassins had made a complete fool out of him. He, a majestic dais, had surprisingly been deceived by some lowly cats. If the young sound woman didn't have an additional hidden protector, wouldn't the crafty machinations of the other party had been successful? Boom, boom. With unprecedented rage and resentment, the dais youth sank into a berserk state. A golden light shone from his body. Instantly, his presence became a lot more terrifying. Initial Sage Flux Expert, Mid-Sage Flux Expert, Late Sage Flux Expert. In a few moments, his presence rose repeatedly, rising to the extreme which caused palpitations to everyone present. If it had been an ordinary human flux expert, the crowd might not have been so terrified, but they were witnessing a late-stage sage flux expert from the most powerful deice bloodline in the world. Everyone on the scene was swept away. Li Yunmu, who was also watching the proceedings, was forced to retreat by several steps, destroying countless chairs. He was not the only one though. The spectators from all alien races were forced to retreat by the murderous intent in the air. Only 6 genuine powerhouses could keep their feet firmly planted in their original location in the entire auction house. Li Yunmu swept a glance over the room and found that one of the 6 people was the human powerhouse whom he had previously identified. He clearly knew that this character was a late-stage sage flux expert. Even so, while facing the deice youth whose strength had already swelled to late-stage sage flux expert, this powerhouse creased his brows slightly and in the end took the initiative to retreat. Clearly, he wasn't thinking of getting involved in the berserk deice youth's battle. All of you heavenly cats need to die. The deice youth whose strength had increased greatly looked at the 3 sage cats who had humiliated him with a fiendish expression on his face. But at this time, a boom rang out from above the auction house as a fierce person had stamped on the roof. A seemingly savage person pushed through with his berserk strength. Child of Deice, don't kill the 3 of them, but deliver them to me. A terrifyingly huge hand which emitted a halo and was filled with threatening intent attacked with a loud sound. Bang! When the 2 attacks which held enormous strength met, Li Yunmu used all of his strength to shield Wang Ren, the ordinary teacher, and retreated from the scene. Once the 2 attacks dispersed, he finally saw the identity of the person through the roof broken by the explosion. Sire, you finally came, the female Pangu warriors present on the scene shouted out with excitement. The extremely tyrannical character was so muscular, people would raise their eyebrows upon seeing him. However, the presence he emitted alarmed Li Yunmu. He was a great circle sage flux expert. He was definitely a great circle sage flux expert, which Pangu called a Pangu sage among themselves. In Li Yunmu's view, this character which was a true legend was only a step away from entering the deity realm. No wonder, no wonder. Only a genuinely terrifying character on the level of a great circle sage flux expert could use a punch with just the exact strength to negate the power of the deice youth's offense. Why are you blocking me? The deice youth was forced a few steps back by the power of the punch. He was about to flare up, but the opponent gave him a meaningful look. The deice youth, who was awfully arrogant, instantly calmed down from his berserk fury. He took a deep breath, and although his expression was still filled with unwillingness, he didn't dare to move. They have broken the rule of my people, so I shall deal with them, the Pangu powerhouse declared to the entire auction house without giving any face to the deice youth. Chapter 540, The Construction of the Blood Nest. The Pangu powerhouse suppressed the deice youth and grabbed the 3 sage cats with a single hand like they were 3 small ants. After that, he leaped back and rushed out through the hole created above everyone's head. After that, the sound of footsteps came from outside, and one after another, squads of Pangu soldiers rushed in. It seemed that Pangu city's guards had finally hurried over once everything had already been settled. With their presence, all the people and their matters were put in order after a strict interrogation. Li Yunmu and Wang Ren also weren't any exceptions. However, since Li Yunmu hadn't made any moves during the whole affair and hadn't indulged in any suspicious activities, he was quickly released from the scene. After returning to their small courtyard, Li Yunmu only felt a faint sense of regret apart from the shock from personally witnessing the strength of a terrifying great circle sage flux expert powerhouse. This time, he hadn't succeeded in gaining hold of his ultimate target, the Pangu true armor. But when the situation in the auction house developed without restraints, he had personally experienced the innate valor of the Pangu and deice. He was especially amazed by the great circle sage flux expert who had shocked everyone on the scene and made the final decision. Even if Li Yunmu was far from the center of the battle, he could still profoundly sense the tyrannical combat strength. If the former was an enormous giant who could overturn the heavens, then Li Yunmu felt like he was only a midget in comparison. The disparity between them was this enormous without the least bit of exaggeration. Even if his present combat strength would allow him to battle with a mid-stage human sage flux expert for a period of time, he still felt helpless in front of the Great Circle Pangu sage. If he hadn't personally experienced it, Li Yunmu probably wouldn't have been able to imagine that the disparity between them was so large. Although the difference between late-stage Sage Flux Expert and Great Circle Sage Flux Expert was only that of a small realm, it was as terrifying as the difference between heaven and earth. The difference between the late human Sage Flux Expert whom he'd seen in the auction previously and the Great Circle Pangu Expert couldn't be explained based on numbers alone. If the late-stage human Flux Expert or the Deus Youth burst forth with their full strength, it would almost be equivalent to the battle sages of earth. In comparison, the Great Circle Pangu powerhouse was on an even higher level, surpassing the battle sages and quasi-deities of earth. In the last couple days, Li Yunmu had believed that after he obtained Azure Dragon Expert armor, he possessed the strength to defend himself against sage-level powerhouses. But only after personally experiencing the day's event did he come to know that his present combat strength was barely sufficient to fight against mid-stage Sage Flux experts. He couldn't even compare to a late-stage human Sage Flux expert, let alone talk about Great Circle Sage Flux expert. Not to mention that races like Deus and Pangu possessed innate tyrannical bloodlines. The Great Circle Pangu powerhouse who had suppressed everyone at the end had been clad in a 12-patterned Pangu true armor, and the weapon he was carrying on his back also had 12 patterns. Only during the auction did Li Yunmu get to experience how enormous was the gap between Pangu and human powerhouses on the same level. They are really worthy of being among the 5 most powerful races in terms of comprehensive strength with measly several million people. Li Yunmu could finally comprehend why humanity with its several hundred billion members was so apprehensive about this alien race which possessed an innately tyrannical bloodline. Once Li Yunmu returned his courtyard, he remembered the unknown serpent beast's egg purchased from the auction. He hurriedly said a few words to Wang Ren and entered seclusion. The instant he returned to his own residence, Li Yunmu quickly entered his heavenly world and summoned God Flowing Cloud. So what's the matter with this serpent beast egg? I want an explanation. Li Yunmu looked toward the fragment of soul separated from an ancient god whom he had subdued into becoming his follower. There are 2 reasons why I told you to get it. The first reason is that I realized that Master didn't possess enough resources to ensure your win in the bid for Pangu True Armor. The second reason was that the strategic value of this serpent egg in combat wouldn't be any lower than that of the 12-patterned Pangu True Armor. Thus, I asked you to change your target to this serpent beast egg which no one recognized. When God Flowing Wind saw that Li Yunmu had returned with the serpent egg from the auction, he breathed a sigh of relief. You mean to say that this spirit-grade serpent egg is that valuable? How could it compare with the 12-patterned Pangu True Armor? Li Yunmu's breathing became heavy, but he was still somewhat unconvinced. After having personally witnessed the Great Circle Pangu expert suppressing everything, he found it impossible. It has to be known that a 12-patterned Pangu True Armor was congealed from all of the vitality of an expert who had no hopes of reaching deity realm. It was a true armor congealed from the body of a Great Circle Pangu sage, so how many of them were present in the world? The whole process of congealing and materializing even required the long period of 81 years. Although it is slightly inferior to a 12-patterned Pangu True Armor, the disparity isn't large. Please take a look, Master Yunmu. At some point in time, God Flowing Wind had started to arrange something. He first brought out all the resources Li Yunmu could offer, then began to command the 300 ape gods to make some arrangements. Li Yunmu wasn't someone who suspected people, since such people lacked the determination. Thus, he kept attentively watching the proceedings without saying anything. After watching for a long while, he finally began to make out the general outline of what God Flowing Wing was trying to do. He was commanding the ape gods to construct what seemed like an ancient altar. What I have laid down is actually the blood-breeding nest from the ancient times which has been forgotten in times gone by. Only this way could we hatch this spirit-grade beast egg. God Flowing Wind commanded the 300 ape gods to excavate a large pond which he filled with blood, then went around by himself to arrange 8 devil beast cores around it. While commanding the ape gods, he was also explaining his actions to Li Yunmu. This was because he'd noticed a hint of pain appear on Li Yunmu's originally emotionless face. Yes, when the 8 enormous devil beast cores with a diameter of several meters were used by God Flowing Wind, Li Yunmu indeed had a pained expression on his face. It has to be known that the 8 devil beast cores were the major part of Black Spirit Valley's total wealth. Li Yunmu hadn't used them, but he'd also hadn't dared to reveal them in the auction. Yet now they were being used as one of the materials to create the breeding nest for a spirit-grade beast egg. Although Li Yunmu felt his heart ache, he didn't stop God Flowing Wind from continuing. On the contrary, once he realized what expensive materials were being used, his expression became increasingly more dignified.